The rivalry between the United States and China is one of the defining clashes of our age. Whether in trade or technology or finance, the growing competition between the world's largest and second largest economies affects everything and everyone in between. But a lot of the discussion about that contest is in terms that I often find outdated. For example, people often still talk about it as a clash between capitalism and communism, as if China is still stuck in the era of Mao. Defining it as a clash between a democracy and a one-party state also fails to capture the complexity and nuance of those two massive nations. So this week on The Big View, we're going to attempt to go beyond the simplistic narratives to dive more deeply into the Chinese economy and how it compares to the US. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories on global business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thar-Larsen. One problem with tackling this topic is that most informed observers are either much more familiar with the United States or have spent most of their lives studying and living in the People's Republic. Relatively few, in my experience, have first-hand knowledge and understanding of both sides. That's what makes this week's guest, Dan Wang, unusual. Dan was born in China in Yunnan province, but moved to Canada with his parents at the age of 7. He studied and worked in the United States and then spent 6 years working as a technology analyst for Govt, the independent research firm, in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Shanghai. There he got a close-up view of the Chinese economy and society, its technology industry, and its other policies, including first-hand experience of President Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy. Dan is now back in the United States as a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover History Lab, and he has just published a book that draws on his experiences. It's called Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Dan Wang, welcome to The Big View.
My pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with the central theme of your book, which is the comparison of China and the US. It's very common for people to talk about the two as polar opposites. That China's communist, the US is capitalist, the US is a democracy, China's a one-party state, and so on. But you've gone for a different distinction. You say China's an engineering state and the US is a lawyerly society. Can you just expand on that a bit?
Peter, I think the conflict, tension, Cold War, whatever to call it, with the US and China is now too important to be understood with these musty old terms like socialist or democratic or neoliberal, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. And having spent 6 years recently in China between 2017 to 2023, mostly studying its technology development, I really wanted to come up with a new way to understand both of these countries. And China is a country I call the engineering state because at various points, the entirety of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the highest ruling echelon of the Communist Party, had degrees in engineering of a very Soviet sort. And the issue with engineers is that they build. Now, whether that is homes or coal or solar or bridges and highways, whatever it is. The problem is that they're also very literal-minded about treating society as a math exercise. So I also spend a lot of time thinking about the one-child policy, as well as zero-COVID, which I lived through, in which they are social engineers, population engineers, applying a sledgehammer to infrastructure as well as society alike. And I contrast that with the United States, which I call the lawyerly society, because all the presidents go to law school. Most members of the US Congress go to law school. And the issue with lawyers is that they tend to block everything, good and bad. So you may not have stupid ideas like the one-child policy, which was a atrocity towards rural women in particular. You also don't have very functional infrastructure in the New York area, in California, or indeed almost anywhere in the United States.
But this wasn't always the case, right? I mean, the we can debate when China became an engineering state and when the US was sort of taken over by lawyers. So there's been an evolution there. When would you date that current dichotomy?
I certainly don't want to be too literal with this
Right.
framing. I want to be a little bit playful with this device. But I would say that there is an aspect of engineering in Chinese history, even through the imperial times, when the emperors ordered people to build great walls or
Mm.
build grand canals. And there has been a little bit of a sense that the emperors and the mandarins have barely hesitated to entirely reorder a peasant's relationship to her land. And that really carried through the 1980s when Deng Xiaoping, as a corrective to the Mao years, decided to elevate engineers above any other discipline into the top ranks of the Communist Party, and really to have them bring an engineering optimization mindset to the entire country. Similarly, with the United States, if you take a look at the first 13 presidents of the US from Washington to Lincoln, all but 3 of them had practiced law. And so, some were country lawyers like Lincoln. Andrew Jackson was never formally trained, but the roots of the roots of lawyers are somewhat deeper in the United States, such that Tocqueville, when he wrote Democracy in America, had already said that there are no aristocrats in America aside from those that sit on the bench and at the bar. And you can see that also being very pronounced in the last few decades, in which the really remarkable fact is that between 1980 to 2020, every member of the Democratic Party's presidential ticket, president and vice president, had gone to law school. And they're a little bit less dominant in the Republican Party, but they're definitely there as well.
Mm. I guess the current president then is a bit of a break with that.
But his vice president of
Right.
Yale Law School, not so much. But certainly Trump is a break of many things, including in that tradition.
So one thing I'm really keen to talk about, I mean, there's so many different things we could talk about in relation to the US and China, and also in relation to China. But, for our listeners, I think one of the big sort of themes in recent years has been this, or in the last few decades maybe, has been this rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse, really. Initially as a place to make cheap goods, and then becoming really very skilled at really quite advanced processes. And I think there's few better, probably few better and underexplored examples of this than the China's total dominance of the manufacturing of the iPhone, for example.
Right.
You talk about China being good at something you call process knowledge. What do you mean by that?
What is technology? I think that technology is 3 different things. The first and most obvious is the things that we can easily observe, the tooling and the physical products. And so we can make a kitchen analogy. I had scrambled eggs this morning. These are the pots, pans, and the stove needed to make some eggs. Technology is also a second component, which is written instruction, more or less. And these are things like blueprints, patents, and again, sticking with the kitchen analogy of recipes. The third, and I think most important, technology is what I call process knowledge, which is can also be thought of as industrial experience. It is essentially all the things that cannot be written down with respect to making any product simple or difficult. So if I were to put someone who had never cooked in his life before, give him the most sophisticated kitchen, the most exquisite recipe, we cannot be sure that he will make a bowl of scrambled eggs without making a big mess out of everything. And I think that is really the crucial thing that is the driver of a lot of Chinese manufacturing progress. Now, certainly China's industrial progress has been driven by some degree of industrial subsidies, government support, stealing, to use a less polite word, as well as a lot of investment and typical capitalist competitive processes. But I think the most important part is simply that China has built a vast manufacturing workforce, which is probably north of 100 million people, making goods every day, becoming the most experienced and sophisticated producers of some of the most complex electronics products in the world, like iPhones and to some extent electric vehicle batteries, and being able to scale that, being able to make the best in the world, pushing the cost curves down and the technology frontiers forward. And that has been, I think, the much greater driver of China's technology success.
So that's as distinct from the things that people talk about particularly in the US. You hear them talk about this, as you say, it's all the intellectual property has been stolen. The government subsidizes. They don't care how much money they lose. They they've been put other rivals out of business through dumping, and that's how they've ended up dominating solar panels and things like that. So, but you're basically saying it's not just that.
It's not just that.
Right.
Senator Tom Cotton in the U.S. Congress recently tweeted, "China doesn't innovate; it only copies and steals." I think that is a totally incomplete picture, and the more that we're wedded to these sort of simplistic ideas that they're not fundamentally innovative in some important way, the less we are really able to grapple with what makes China strong, and that is something that we need to much better understand.
Well, yes, because the debate in the US now is obviously there is an effort to try and bring some of this manufacturing back. And I guess if that's going to be successful, then you have to sort of understand what the sources of that success are. I mean, it sounds from what you're saying like it won't necessarily be that easy to bring the manufacturing back. Do you think, like, what would be the elements you would say that would be required to shift the balance a bit on that?
I think that it would be a fundamentally wrong view if the US had this assumption that the US is the great font of all technology in the world and that the only reason it is losing is because the Chinese are cheating. And I'm still kind of tickled by this idea from Trump's first trade war in 2018, in which the US Trade Representative levied these ideas that China is playing unfair, which is really words that we use in the playground and not something I expected from a legal document. But I understand that unfairness is a legal term, but that was kind of tickled me. And I think that we shouldn't see that any country, not the UK, not the US, as being some fundamental innovator and that no one else can do it. Because technology tends to travel around as it did from the US to East Asia and earlier on from the UK to the US. And I certainly think that it is really important to study China's successes as well. So, if we think about how China has become a major technology power since the 1980s, certainly it is the case that subsidies are part of the program, some degree of protectionist policy that made it easier for Chinese firms to gain at least domestic market share. There was also a really big effort to bring foreign companies in to teach Chinese how to make the most advanced products. Now, Peter, you brought up the iPhone earlier. That is made in China, designed in California. But that was an effort by the Chinese government to bring in the most advanced technology leader at the time to really train Chinese workers. And Apple is not exactly an exception here. China has done the same with Tesla. And after Tesla moved into the market, Chinese EV makers became much more competitive because they had to be. And, there are tens of thousands of US companies still manufacturing extensively in China today. And so as a starting point, I would encourage the Americans to say, how do we bring in the most advanced technology leaders? They've done that with semiconductors into the American Southwest, but perhaps the Americans ought to consider bringing in Chinese electric vehicle battery makers as well.
Yeah, that would be an interesting move. Actually, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you hear, I think Trump has even said, like on some sort of campaign trail, like, "Oh, well, I'd be happy for them to come here and make some cars as long as they employed some people." So, who knows? But the auto industry, to me, that is in some ways is a really fascinating case study because, when China first opened up, as you said, they sort of invited in Western car makers on the condition that they form joint ventures, and I guess the assumption was that, over time, the joint venture partners would learn from Mercedes and BMW and GM and so forth, how to make cars, and that was an almost total failure, right? So in the combustion engine era, it was Western cars, Western designed, Western Western car brands that dominated in China. And then with electric vehicles, it's been the complete opposite. How do you explain that?
I certainly agree that China didn't make good cars in the internal combustion engine age. And I think one of the problems with that process was that, if you are a Shanghai automaker, being able to partner with a German or Japanese or American automaker, then what typically was the case with a lot of these joint ventures was that the Chinese contributed land as well as labor, and then the Western automakers brought most of the technology, and
Mm.
they were able to, sell pretty good cars dependent on Western technology without having to make a lot of important investments. And so they were simply able, for the most part, to sit on their hands and just wait for this mana of technology to arrive every year from the foreign automakers. I guess I wouldn't call it a complete or total failure because at the very least, the Chinese internal combustion engines built up enough of a supply chain and built up enough of a domestic ecosystem, and built up enough labor expertise really to set the stage for a transformation in the EV era. And it was in the EV era when the Chinese automakers knew that they couldn't really compete on a better diesel engine or better combustion engine with the Germans, that they decided that electric vehicle batteries were maybe something that they could figure out.
Mm.
And to produce a simpler car based on EVs, that was something that they were really able to take off. And I think it is certainly one of these examples that Chinese technology transfer policies manifesting in these joint venture relationships with foreign automakers was not anything like an astounding success. And so this is also one of these examples where, to stick with an auto analogy, the Chinese state is pressing the brakes as well as the gas on industrial policy at all times. And the record is at least very deeply mixed.
You mean pressing the brakes in terms of what sort of holding back companies that would otherwise do better?
That the persistent meddling in different industries, picking winners, offering so many subsidies that new entrants are always coming in and competing down the profit pool and creating all sorts of waste and redundancy that is at least as much hurt as it is help.
Mm. I mean, the other result of that is huge overcapacity, right, in some industries. I mean, obviously, I think you have this great stat in your book that China has the capacity to produce 60 million cars a year, and the global auto market is 90 million cars a year.
Right.
So in theory, it could make 2/3 of the global car market.
I'm pretty sure that's a Brad Setzer statistic, so it's Brad's fault.
Okay, well, we'll credit it to him. But these, and obviously lots of countries are now worried about, being flooded with Chinese exports, cars and other things, and taking measures as a result. But there are decisions by central and local governments underlying this, right, to kind of keep these companies going, even if they're not profitable, to keep the factories open because laying off people would be more painful and so forth. So, how do you think that? What happens to that? I mean, it feels sort of unsustainable, and yet it carries on.
Yeah, well, plenty of things feel unsustainable, and yet they carry on, 3 times a day before breakfast. So you're absolutely right to highlight the role of local governments here. And in my time in China, I remember speaking to government officials as well as people in think tanks who would tell me that, local governments love the auto industry in particular because it's actually a fairly straightforward process of turning subsidies into jobs, which is one of the things that they care the most about.
Mm.
And so you can produce a lot of automotives that may be good and may not be. But what the local governments care about is just getting people into the doors of factories so that they are meeting all of their metrics set by the party's organization department. And one of the problems that creates is extensive protectionism within China, such that the Shenzhen government really prefers the Shenzhen automaker, and the Shanghai government really prefers the Shanghai automaker. And so there's all sorts of hidden, strange protectionisms within the Chinese market. It is really difficult for automotive companies to go bankrupt because there's often this, soft guarantee from the government that they will be rescued if they're ever bankrupt. And I did cite the example of an automaker, I believe in Hefei, that did declare bankruptcy, and then a few months later started churning out autos again after the government started giving a bailout. And so, in the US and UK, maybe we worry about bailouts for the banks. In China, maybe we should stop the bailouts for the automakers.
Yeah. How then should we think about the sort of the relationship between state-owned companies and private companies? There's another one of these sort of perennial debates in China, is sort of, which one is on the up, and is the pendulum swinging one way or another? I mean, obviously, it's sometimes quite difficult to really draw a clear line between what is state-owned and what isn't, if you're talking about all these subsidies and these other relationships. But it is clear that there was a quite concerted and intentional crackdown on some of the big Chinese private tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth. You say in the book you avoid the use of the term tech crackdown because they weren't cracking down on all tech. But how do you, sort of looking back on that episode, how should we think about that in terms of China's development?
Yeah. Well, I avoid the term tech crackdown, and I also am a little bit reluctant to think about this in terms of private firms versus state firms. And one of the reasons is that, as you say, the line between state and private is a fairly murky one in China, and also one that is pretty difficult to really try to disentangle. And I would furthermore state that in the Sea era, the pendulum has been swinging pretty hard towards state companies that has disfavored private enterprises. But I think the way that I would view this is that I think the state is viewing things not so much as a means to increase the central government's power or increase the Communist Party's power. I think what is most important is that the state really dislikes certain sectors and is in favor of other sectors. And part of the interpretation of the crackdown on especially digital platforms in 2020, 2021 was that the state had decided that a lot of these companies have been earning, monopolistic profits or poorly regulated, and we're creating all sorts of political problems in, I think, exactly the same terms that the U.S. and the U.K. Would discuss them. The difference is that I think the Communist Party also had another dimension of trying to encourage people working in virtual industries to move into harder industries, such that the companies most able to offer the competitive wages aren't banks in Canary Wharf, where we're sitting, Peter, or tech firms in Silicon Valley, but rather maybe more something like the national rail operator, if we can indulge in that sort of fantasy. Now, in the US and UK, we cannot indulge in that fantasy to try to make these genius quants go fix the signal failures on the trains, but the Chinese can indulge in this fantasy. And they have tried to indulge in this fantasy with some positive results, perhaps, but also a lot of really disastrous results in terms of frightening the living daylights out of the entrepreneurs, as well as making youth unemployment significantly worse.
Yeah, and sort of contributing to people trying to leave the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which maybe brings sort of good segue into another industry that I'm interested to get your views on, which is semiconductors. Because, I mean, you would think that given what we've been talking about, you might expect China to have a more competitive chip industry than it does. And obviously it is catching up, and you may have a different view on this, but it's still the case that the sort of the most advanced chips are designed by companies like NVIDIA and manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. So how would you how would you assess the Chinese chip industry at the moment, and whether or not it can sort of close that gap?
Catching up.
Right.
I think that there are two great frontiers left for China to master. It is semiconductors as well as aviation. And these are not coincidentally some of the most scientifically complex industries that China has yet to master. Now, my operating assumption when I think about China tech is that anything where the science is relatively established and all of the problems lie in execution risk among manufacturers, that is something that the Chinese are really able to do. So if I'm thinking about something like an iPhone, putting together an iPhone at that sort of cost structure, at that scale is really something that, Foxconn handling Chinese workers is still best able to do on the mainland, though I know some of that is moving abroad. If I'm thinking about something like an electric vehicle battery, where the science is relatively established, but there's about a dozen discrete steps involved in making an electric vehicle battery, all of which require perfect handoff, that is something that the Chinese are much better than the Americans at actually doing. What marks aviation as well as semiconductors into a category more their own is that the challenge is not only with the manufacturing, which is extraordinarily difficult, but these involve the complex integration of different scientific disciplines. And that is something that the Chinese are still relatively weaker on. So if I think about something like semiconductors, that is the integration of chemistry and electrical engineering and computer science. With aviation, with the Rolls-Royce engine, that is the integration of things like material science and electrodynamics and um, aerodynamics and mechanical engineering. And so these are all much more challenging, longer term projects that the Americans, the British, the Germans have put more effort in over a longer period of time. They have more experience managing these things very well.
Yeah.
The Chinese firms are much more state dominated, and they are still relatively weaker on science if we just take a look at their universities, although that may change. But that's why I think for now, the Chinese haven't been able to master this. And at the same time, I think that the universities are improving, and the West is not necessarily investing so much in universities anymore. And so I still think that it is more likely than not that over a matter of not years, but decades, China will become much better at even semiconductors as well as aviation.
And that then feeds into the sort of the whole artificial intelligence question. I mean, the dominant view, which you hear from tech CEOs in the US but also from government officials, is that the US in the lead. China's trying to catch up. The US is going to great lengths to make it harder for China to catch up by restricting exports of NVIDIA chips and so forth. And then along comes a company like DeepSeek and seems to be able to do quite a lot of the stuff that the Western AI models can do without access to all the same technology. I mean, clearly, from the Western perspective, it's an arms race, and one that I guess various people for various reasons are kind of talking up as being kind of really existential. What does it look like from the other side? How is this being viewed in China?
Living in China throughout the first Trump trade war, which was very well known in terms of the tariffs, and also slightly less well known, but equally important in terms of technology controls that the Trump administration imposed on Chinese tech leaders, in which it deprived semiconductors to a couple of Chinese firms and then expanded that to many more.
Yeah.
What I saw living then in Beijing was that Chinese tech leaders really started to freak out about their access to American components. They would never know if they were designated to a blacklist maintained by the dustiest offices of the U.S. Department of Commerce that they never heard about, in which case they would very substantially lose a lot of their ability to produce their most critical products. And so one of the things I observed living in China was that the Chinese government has no doubt always been deeply, deeply interested in technological sovereignty, some measure of self-sufficiency. But the private companies were usually able to push back on some of those demands to say, well, what we want is to become global technology leaders, as Huawei was in 5G or the mobile handset business. And there was a and enough of the functionaries or technocrats or leadership within the Communist Party to say, well, yes, we do want some degree of technological leadership, and Huawei buying from Qualcomm is an acceptable outcome. But when the US government denied Huawei to use Qualcomm, then Huawei really had no choice but to really try to build up the domestic technology ecosystem. And what I saw living in Beijing and then Shanghai was that Huawei became all sweetness and light to domestic Chinese companies that previously it would never give the time of the day to, so that smaller Chinese companies were finally able to qualify into Chinese tech leaders' procurement systems. And so what I saw was that the US government created this enormous surge among Chinese private companies. And again, I know that is a term of art, but for many more of China's at least most formidable technology companies, Huawei, DJI, SMIC, ByteDance, all of which had something to fear from the US government to really try to pull themselves up from their bootstraps and to create an alternative technology ecosystem.
But is the sort of the emphasis on AI quite as all encompassing as it appears to be in the US, for example, at the moment? This sort of sense that like it's an arms race and someone's going to get there first, and whoever gets there first will dominate. I mean, that's what you hear from the US side. I just wonder how what's the sort of Chinese thinking about that?
I think it is impossible to overmatch the US. Peter, I am on the campus of Stanford University, where it really does feel like many 20-year-olds are pretty serious about building God in a box.
Right.
And I don't think so much that the Chinese leadership thinks quite in those terms. Now, there's some debate within the specialist community of is Xi Jinping AGI pilled? Does he want to build God in a box? And so far, the conclusions are still pretty tentative. It does not seem like that is the primary framing that the Chinese are thinking about it. The U.S. now is thinking about things like a decisive strategic advantage, in which if you invent God in a box, months or weeks or even minutes before the Chinese, then that is such a decisive advantage that the Chinese can't really hope to catch up. And I am pretty skeptical of that view. I think that competition will never be determined by any single technology. I don't believe that we could contain the deity into a small device. I believe that, even if we do manage to get something like AGI that we can all, agree it resembles a very powerful being, what matters is not only the compute chips trained for it, it's also the inference chips, which are more mature, require a lot of electricity. And that is something that the Chinese have in droves. China has a lot of mature chips because the US government has in part forced them to have overcapacity and mature node chips. China is now producing twice as much electricity as America is, and that pace is still really, the gap is continuing to widen. China has a lot of data. China has a lot of talent. And so even if we were, somehow to, really believe in something like a decisive strategic advantage, I still think that China has a pretty good go at being able to outmatch the US here.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's sort of a good place to try and finish up, because one of the sort of, maybe I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but my sense is one of the ways you sum up the difference between the two is that the US is good at software and China's good at hardware. And if it came to a sort of a confrontation, then you ultimately you need the hardware to win a conflict. But I guess maybe just to sort of to finish up this conversation, the US is obviously trying quite hard to address some of these perceived deficiencies or shortfalls in the sort of hardware area, and you could argue that China's doing the opposite, in terms of software. Where do you see that ending up? Do you think we end up in a situation where maybe they become more alike?
I think that, thinking about the ideas of Rene Girard, we have to be really careful to choose our rivals and enemies, because we certainly will end up looking more like them. And right now, I think, in the first year of the Trump administration, Trump is looking sometimes with longing at his buddy Xi Jinping. And in some ways, being a Canadian in the US now feels very, very, very slightly like being a Canadian in China, in which, every policy, no matter how boneheaded, will be defended by a core cadre of people, in which every problem is blamed on foreigners or traders, and in which there is much more of a cult of personality around the leader. Now, I certainly see that the Chinese are pretty intent on catching up in terms of patching up the scientific deficiencies that they've had before. And I am not certain that the Americans are really committed to catching up on its manufacturing capabilities, on trying to make more clean energy rather than going backwards into coal. And that is something that I would like to see from the US, to learn some of the good parts of China, not the autocratic parts of China. Now, I think that you're right that the Chinese are much more into manufacturing. US is more into software. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that they are really counting on HEI, because this is sort of their best ticket into winning the competition with China. And I'm wondering, just because we are sitting here again in London, what the British will be able to bring to the table. One of my little gags here is that Britain is really good at the sounding clever industries, Peter. That is journalism, university, finance, television. And so, if the US has HEI, the Chinese have, the manufacturing, maybe the Brits will still be able to comment on all of these important things with a really nice, clever line. What do you think?
Yeah, I hope so. And maybe the accent is a competitive advantage in all of this as well, because it sort of sounds clever to some people. But that is a conversation for another time, if we haven't all been replaced by avatars at the end of this. But Dan, this was really great. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing how it unfolds.
Thank you very much, Peter.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Dan for coming into the studio in London, and as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. Don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Viewsroom, a lively conversation between Reuters Breaking News columnists, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team, Reuters World News Every Day and Reuters Econ World. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and leave a comment and let us know what you thought. And don't forget to check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakviews.com and reuters.com.